Miles Davis discovered a brilliant pianist. Then everything changed. It was March 7th, 1963, at a small jazz club called the Blue Room in Detroit, and Miles was traveling through the city after a recording session in Chicago when he decided to stop for a late-night drink and maybe catch some local music. He wasn't expecting anything extraordinary, just a quiet evening before heading back to New York. But what he heard that night would change not only his own musical direction, but launch one of the most important pianists in jazz history into stardom. Sitting at an old upright piano in the corner of the dimly lit club was a 22-year-old musician named Herbie Hancock, playing with such sophisticated harmonic understanding and rhythmic innovation that Miles stopped mid-conversation and focused entirely on the music. Herbie was playing to an audience of maybe 15 people, most of whom were paying more attention to their drinks than the music, completely unaware that they were witnessing extraordinary talent. But Miles recognized genius when he heard it. What he did next, approaching Herbie after the set, the conversation that followed, and the opportunity he offered, would transform a local Detroit pianist into one of the most influential musicians of the modern era, and give Miles's quintet the harmonic foundation that would create some of the most revolutionary jazz recordings of the 1960s. By the end of that night, both musicians' lives had changed forever, proving that sometimes the most important discoveries happen in the most unexpected places, when talent meets recognition and opportunity meets preparation. It was March 7th, 1963, and Miles Davis was experiencing one of those restless periods that periodically overtook him between major projects. He had just completed a recording session in Chicago for Columbia Records, laying down tracks for what would eventually become part of his 7 Steps to Heaven album. But instead of heading straight back to New York, he decided to take a detour through Detroit. Detroit in 1963 was a city buzzing with musical energy. Motown was just beginning to revolutionize popular music, and the city's jazz scene was producing some of the most innovative musicians in the country. Miles had heard rumors about the talent emerging from Detroit's clubs and music schools, and his curiosity had gotten the better of him. The Blue Room was not the kind of place where jazz legends typically spent their evenings. It was a small, unpretentious club on the east side of Detroit, with maybe 50 seats, an old upright piano, and a clientele that consisted mainly of local musicians, music students, and neighborhood regulars. The lighting was dim, the drinks were cheap, and the atmosphere was relaxed in the way that only truly authentic jazz clubs could be. Miles arrived around 10 p.m., wearing his characteristic dark clothing and sunglasses, and took a seat at a small table near the back of the room. He ordered a scotch and settled in to observe the local music scene, not expecting anything more than a pleasant way to pass the time before continuing his journey home. The first set featured a standard jazz trio, bass, drums, and piano, playing familiar standards with competent but unremarkable skill. Miles listened politely while nursing his drink and checking his watch, already beginning to consider calling it an early night. But during the break between sets, something changed. The original pianist stepped away from the instrument, and a young black man who had been sitting quietly at the bar approached the piano and began to play. What emerged from the old upright piano was unlike anything Miles had heard in years. The young pianist, whose name Miles would soon learn, was Herbie Hancock, began with what sounded like a familiar chord progression, but immediately began transforming it with harmonic substitutions that were both sophisticated and emotionally compelling. His technique was flawless, but more importantly, his musical thinking was advanced, far beyond his apparent age. Herbie was 22 years old, a recent graduate of Grinnell College, who had moved to Detroit to pursue graduate studies in music while playing local clubs to support himself. He had been classically trained, but had fallen in love with jazz during his college years, spending countless hours listening to records by Miles, Bill Evans, and Ahmad Jamal, trying to understand the harmonic and rhythmic innovations that made their music so compelling. What Miles was hearing that night was the result of years of intense study and practice. Herbie's playing combined classical technique with an intuitive understanding of jazz harmony that allowed him to take familiar musical material and transform it into something entirely new. Miles stopped his conversation with the bartender and focused entirely on the music. This was not just competent local talent. This was genius in its early stages. Raw talent combined with sophisticated musical education and an innovative musical mind. Herbie played for nearly 45 minutes, moving through a series of jazz standards that he transformed with his unique harmonic approach. Autumn Leaves became a showcase for complex reharmonization techniques. All the Things You Are turned into an exploration of rhythmic displacement that maintained the song's essential character while revealing new possibilities within its structure. Most remarkably, Herbie seemed completely unconscious of the effect his playing was having on the small audience. He played with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was primarily playing for himself, exploring musical ideas for the pure joy of discovery rather than trying to impress anyone. Miles watched the young pianist with growing excitement. He had been searching for a new piano player for his quintet, someone who could match the innovative energy that John Coltrane had brought to his saxophone sections. The pianists he had auditioned in New York were all competent professionals, but none had demonstrated the kind of creative thinking that could push his music in new directions. What he was hearing from Herbie Hancock was exactly what he had been looking for: a pianist who understood the jazz tradition deeply enough to transform it, who possessed the technical skills to execute complex musical ideas, and who had the creative courage to explore uncharted harmonic territories. When Herbie finished his impromptu set and began to step away from the piano, Miles made a decision that would change both of their careers forever. He walked over to where Herbie was standing, introduced himself, and asked if they could talk. Herbie was initially stunned. Like every young jazz musician of his generation, he idolized Miles Davis and owned every record the trumpeter had ever made. The idea that Miles Davis had not only heard him play, but wanted to have a conversation, seemed almost surreal. "That was beautiful playing," Miles said in his characteristically quiet, direct manner. "Where did you study?" Herbie explained his background, his classical training, his college years at Grinnell, his recent move to Detroit to pursue graduate studies while developing his jazz playing in local clubs. "You're wasting your time in school," Miles said bluntly. "You already know more about music than most of these professors are going to teach you. What you need is experience playing with musicians who can challenge you." Miles paused, studying the young pianist's face. "I'm putting together a new quintet. I need a piano player who can think, not just play. Someone who understands that jazz is about creating something new every night, not just executing arrangements." Herbie was struggling to process what he was hearing. Miles Davis, his musical hero, was offering him a position in his quintet. "I don't know if I'm ready for something like that," Herbie said honestly. "I've only been playing jazz seriously for a few years." "Ready?" Miles replied. "Nobody's ever ready. You learn by doing, by playing with musicians who force you to grow. The question isn't whether you're ready. The question is whether you're willing to take the risk." Miles handed Herbie his business card. "Think about it, but don't think too long. I'm starting rehearsals next week in New York. If you're interested, call me in 2 days." With that, Miles finished his drink and left the club, leaving Herbie standing at the piano with a business card that represented the opportunity of a lifetime. The next 2 days were the longest of Herbie's young life. He spent hours at the piano, playing through Miles's recordings and trying to imagine himself contributing to that level of musical sophistication. He called his parents, his teachers, and his musician friends, all of whom encouraged him to take the chance. 2 days later, Herbie made the phone call that would change his life forever. "I'm interested," he told Miles simply. "Good. Miles replied. "Get on a plane to New York. We start rehearsals Monday." 3 days later, Herbie Hancock was standing in a rehearsal studio on the west side of Manhattan, preparing to play with the Miles Davis Quintet for the first time. The other members of the group, Tony Williams on drums, Ron Carter on bass, and Wayne Shorter on tenor saxophone, were all established professionals who welcomed the young pianist but made it clear that he would need to prove himself quickly. The first rehearsal was intimidating but exhilarating. Miles's approach to directing the quintet was minimal but demanding. He would outline basic harmonic structures, suggest general approaches to rhythm and dynamics, and then expect the musicians to develop the music collectively through improvisation and musical conversation. For Herbie, it was like attending graduate school in real-time musical creation. Every song became an opportunity to explore new harmonic possibilities, and every night brought new challenges that forced him to expand his musical thinking. The quintet's first public performance with Herbie was at the Village Vanguard in New York City, just 2 weeks after his discovery in Detroit. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Jazz critics and musicians alike recognized that something special was happening with this new configuration of the Miles Davis Quintet. Herbie's harmonic sophistication provided the perfect complement to Wayne Shorter's innovative compositions and Tony Williams's rhythmic complexity. The quintet began exploring musical territories that none of them could have reached individually. Over the next 5 years, the Miles Davis Quintet with Herbie Hancock would record some of the most important albums in jazz history, including ESP, Mal Smiles, Sorcerer, and Nefertiti. Each album demonstrated the group's growing musical chemistry and their willingness to push the boundaries of what jazz could accomplish. For Herbie, the experience was transformational. Working with Miles taught him not just about music, but about artistic courage, creative risk-taking, and the importance of constant musical evolution. He learned to think of jazz not as a fixed tradition, but as a living language that could be constantly renewed and transformed. The partnership also transformed Miles's music. Herbie's harmonic innovations allowed the quintet to explore post-bop territories that laid the groundwork for Miles's later explorations of jazz-rock fusion. The young pianist's classical training and advanced harmonic thinking provided the perfect bridge between Miles's bebop roots and his future musical directions. Years later, when Herbie had become a major recording artist in his own right, winning Grammy Awards and influencing countless musicians, he would always credit that chance encounter in Detroit as the moment that changed everything for him. "Miles taught me that music is about taking risks," Herbie said in later interviews. "He showed me that the most important thing isn't playing what you know, but being willing to explore what you don't know." That night in Detroit, he didn't just discover a piano player. He taught me how to be a musician. For Miles, finding Herbie represented something equally important. It proved his belief that the best musicians often emerged from unexpected places, and that true talent could be recognized even in the most unlikely circumstances. The story of their first meeting became legendary in jazz circles, not just because of the careers that resulted from it, but because it demonstrated the power of recognition, opportunity, and the courage to take creative risks. The Blue Room in Detroit closed its doors in 1967, but the building still stands, and there's now a small plaque near where the piano used to sit that reads, "On this spot, in March 1963, Miles Davis discovered Herbie Hancock, changing the course of jazz history." The discovery also established a model for how musical mentorship could work at its best, not as formal instruction, but as recognition of existing talent and the provision of opportunities for that talent to develop through real-world experience with master musicians. If this story of unexpected discovery, the power of recognition, and how a single moment of musical encounter can change the course of multiple careers moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with any musician who has ever wondered when their break might come. Any artist who needs to understand that talent can be discovered anywhere. Or anyone who wants to see how mentorship and opportunity can transform potential into achievement. Have you ever had a chance encounter that changed your life's direction? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to check out more stories about the power of recognition and the magic that happens when preparation meets opportunity.